So I'm really excited to introduce Anna today. She's been a research intern at Buck Island Ranch for about 7.5 months now. And she recently graduated from University of Central Florida with a bachelor's in biology. And while she was there, she worked on a range of projects at the UCF Arboretum and also conducted camera trapping research while she was there. And then she coordinated a large showing of Path of the Panther at UCF. So she has a long interest in wildlife and wildlife corridors. And I think that's how she kind of became aware of Archbold. And I was really happy that she could come and work with us at the ranch and part of the wildlife corridor. She's been a really great part of our team, always willing to jump in and help with a wide range of projects. And at the ranch, that means a lot, working with water, soil, sensors, plants, clipping lots of plants. And so she brings a lot of energy and curiosity to her work. And she's also one of our top contributors to iNaturalist at the ranch. And I heard a rumor that she even is the top in plants right now. So congratulations, Anna. One of the things I really appreciated and admired about Anna is how proactive she's been in not just in our lab, but volunteering in other labs. She's helped with almost every lab at the station, I believe. And she worked even at DeLuca on the Grasshopper Sparrow Project. And she helped and volunteered at the Florida Wildlife Corridor Summit and joined in several prescribed fires. So she's really done a lot for Archbold. And it's great to sort of work with her. And also I'm excited to see where she goes in the future. And I'm really looking forward to her sharing her work today, A Tale of Fire and Water, Ecological and Social Dimensions of Fire in Wetland Landscapes. And I think Anna is one of the first interns that's incorporated a social science aspect, which was mentored by our postdoc, Aaliyah. So I'm excited to turn it over to Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And thank you to everyone for being here today, both in person and online, to hear my intern seminar, A Tale of Fire and Water, Ecological and Social Dimensions of Fire in Wetland. So fire and water are the two predominant forces that shape Florida landscapes. One is known for sequestering and storing nutrients, while the other is known for recycling matter back into bioavailable forms. The goal of this project was to look at the short-term effects of what happens when you bring the two together and also explore the human dimensions through stakeholder engagement. Now you may be asking yourself, aren't wetlands full of water? How are they burning? Well, this project looks specifically at seasonal wetlands that actually dry up and reflood with Florida's wet and dry seasons. Under the right conditions, fire naturally rolls through them. They're also known as depressional marshes because they have this hydrological gradient to them that's driven by the annual flooding and drying and leads to distinct zones of vegetation and soil characteristics. They provide vital ecosystem services like water filtration, carbon sequestration, and flood control, as well as critical habitat for many different. So we know these wetlands are super important for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Wetlands embedded in ranchlands are also exposed to grazing and fire, and management practices depend on producers' goals, which can be highly variable, much like these wetlands themselves. Understanding how ranch management practices like grazing and fire affect them is important for understanding how to best manage them. And here we're going to focus on fire. On Buck Island Ranch, Archbold's 10,000-acre working cattle ranch, there are over 600 wetlands dotted along the landscape. Ongoing research has investigated the effects of prescribed burns in pastures and in some of these wetlands, but not much is known about the short-term response, however, on soil nutrients, the detritus layer in the soil, or vegetation. This is also true of the literature. There's been extensive research in upland systems, but not much is known about wetlands. To understand what happens in a wetland in response to fire, it's helpful to think about direct and indirect effects because there's a lot of interactions that come into play here. So when fire rolls through, the combustion of plant material and resulting ash deposition can lead to other effects down the line, like increases in pH, which in turn can affect nutrient concentrations. The heating and combustion of soil can further drive these changes through decreases in the detritus layer and soil organic matter. We wanted to see how some of these effects applied to a set of wetlands being burned on Buck Island Ranch. So we looked at a set of wetlands in South Marsh, semi-native pasture type, so it has a mix of native and introduced grasses. There were 3 experimental wetlands shown in red and 1 control shown in yellow of similar vegetation and soil type. All 3 experimental wetlands are fenced to exclude grazing as a part of other experiments. And although the control was not fenced, it was chosen for its proximity and other shared characteristics, and because it was not included in the fire prescription. We burned during the month of March. And this image in the bottom right corner is representing my sampling points along the hydrological gradient. So there's blue in the center for the interior, green for the mid, and E for the exterior zones. And I'll be referring to that later. So my questions were, do organic matter, phosphorus, and nitrogen change in response to fire? Does species composition change? And do soil and vegetation responses vary across the hydrological gradient? I've hypothesized that nutrient availability would change one day after the fire and return to pre-burn levels 1 month later. Specifically, we expect phosphorus and nitrate to increase, ammonium to decrease due to volatilization, and for these to recover over time, while seeing a persistent depletion of soil organic matter. We expected species composition to change 1 month after fire, and that these would vary along the hydrological gradient. So I laid a transect across each wetland and delineated the exterior, middle, and interior zones based on vegetation. And then I randomly established 6 plots along the transect with 2 in each hydrological gradient. And then sampled these points before the burn, the day after the burn, and a month after the burn. And I got to assist our ranch operations crew with the fires, which was very fun, and they all burned very completely. At each time period, I collected a bunch of data on species composition, including percent bare ground and litter, biomass using a weighted plate, and I also took the heights of 3 individuals of each of 3 most dominant species. I also took environmental data like soil moisture, temperature, and photosynthetically active radiation, PAR. I then sampled the first 0 to 15 centimeters of soil to test for pH, organic matter, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And I also measured the detritus layer. This was a persistent layer of decomposing plant matter that accumulates in wetland soils due to slow decomposition rates. From that soil core, I measured, separated, and weighed. Sampling the day after the burn was slightly different in that rather than species composition, I measured ash depth and weight. So soils were dried and then either ashed for organic matter, re-wet with DI water and pH tested, or sent to UF for analysis of nitrogen using potassium chloride and phosphorus using the Mylic 3 extraction method. So to analyze this soil and species data, we first tested for normality and transformed some variables like detritus depth to true normality. And then all normally distributed variables were analyzed using linear mixed effect models and estimated marginal means. This allowed us to test for variation and make comparisons among time periods and hydrological gradients while accounting for the random effects of each wetland and plot. Non-normally distributed variables were analyzing using Kruskal-Wallis test, and we used non-metric multidimensional scaling to look at species composition, which is an analysis that clusters data in terms of similarity. To answer the question of variability over time and gradient based on direct and indirect effects, I'm going to focus on PAR, pH, detritus, soil nutrients, and species composition. So as a direct effect of the combustion of plant material, and because the wetlands burn really well, PAR significantly increased. This graph is representing the percentage of photosynthetically active radiation that plants are experiencing with time on the x-axis. Each column represents a wetland with the control in red. And as you may notice, the control is missing from this intermediate time period here. That is because since it wasn't burned, I didn't sample it the day after burning. And that was a lesson learned for me because my data would have benefited from that intermediate time period. So that's just an important note about my data going forward. So PAR increase, plant material combustion, ash deposited. But surprisingly, however, no correlation was found between ash deposition and pH. Our analysis also showed that there was no significant change in pH over time. The detritus layer did significantly increase in both our burned and in our control wetlands. So this effect was likely not due to fire, but rather seasonal shifts as the wetland dried out and decomposition rates increased. It was interesting to see that there was significantly less of that detritus layer overall in the control, likely due to the effects of grazing and trampling that this wetland experienced. So what about the soil nutrient response? Here we have a graph showing soil organic matter with time period on the x-axis. And the columns are sorted by hydrological gradient, with exterior in red, middle in green, and the interior in blue. There were no statistically detectable differences, but there does appear to be some variation among the gradient. The day after the burn, the middle appears to decrease, interior appears to increase. And this may be explained by just the sheer variation among wetlands and plot points, which is a variation that was significant. Here we have the same graph broken down by wetland with the control in the top left corner. And even though the mixed effects model was not significant, the wetlands do seem to respond differently. There are apparent trends like in wetland 458, where soil organic matter increased in the interior after fire. Each wetland shows some variability, while the control, even though there isn't a midpoint, just remains very flat. So there seems to be something going on here. And looking at phosphorus and nitrogen, it was the same story. Any variability that we saw was attributable to wetland and plot rather than time or hydrological gradient. So what did the plants think of all of this? We found a very significant effect of burning on species composition. The points in this graph are individual plots, and those that are closer together share more similar species composition. You can see a significant change in the burned wetlands before the burn in red and after the burn in green, whereas the control remains more similar to the pre-burned experimental wetlands. And the wider spread in the red and the green is just because of more plots with all the burned replicates. When we reran this analysis for presence absence using the Jacquard distance method rather than Bray-Curtis, the results were much the same, which seems to suggest that the differences were due to species identity rather than just cover. So these species showed up after burning that were not present in the plots before, some like Caesar weed and Schizarium. And species like maiden cane, Juncus effusus, and Bermuda grass all declined. They vary in their traits like native, exotic, or palatable. And overall, we did find that palatable species significantly increased, which was interesting. So in regards to question 1, we found no significant changes due to fire, though we did see trends attributable to variability among and within wetlands. We found a strong effect on species composition after fire, and across the hydrological gradient, we did not find a significant difference. Again, variability was due to differences among and within wetlands. Though some trends in soil and gradient did seem to appear, with such a small sample size and high variation, it's difficult to draw conclusions from them. I needed more replicates both within wetlands and plots to parse out the effects of fire. Wetlands did seem to respond differently, and this could be due to the heat of the fire, differences in size, shape, basin, hydrology. Also, it would have been nice to have a fenced wetland to exclude grazing also as a control. While it's sometimes nice to compare a true status quo of a wetland on a working landscape, it was just too noisy for this study. Also would have benefited from that intermediate sampling period to have a complete data set. Another question was how deep the soil effect goes. 0 to 15 centimeters is pretty standard for sampling topsoil, but maybe the quantity of soil I collected diluted some of the effects or was removed with the layer of detritus. Species composition change is consistent with other findings we found on Buck Island Ranch, but it would be interesting to see if the strength of the effect persists over time and to do a deeper dive into changes among exotic, weedy, and indicator species. Bottom line, we found that these systems are highly variable. So as I was working on this project and learning about wetland management, some questions about the human dimensions emerged. What does this all mean for land management practices, and what do stakeholders wish that they knew? I hosted a facilitated discussion with a small group of ranchers, land managers, and researchers. And this kind of structured discussion is common for co-production of research to identify knowledge gaps and future directions of study. I followed a what, so what, now what structure to ask questions regarding the current state of management practices, the implications of successes and barriers, and what outputs were desired moving forward. So these are some example questions that I asked participants. Things like, are the wetlands and the grazing and natural lands you work confirmed? Are there any current practices you'd like to see change or continue in the future? And what data do you wish you had? This word cloud is based on the resulting discussion. Larger words were discussed more frequently. And as you can see, some big hitters were things like seasonality, species, exotics, grazing, cattle. Based on these topics, participants helped identify several emergent themes. First of which being seasonality and climate. Participants discussed apparent shifts in hydro periods and how water tables appear to be staying higher longer. Also the importance of frost in killing plant matter and promoting birds, and the impacts of timing and frequency of burn bans causing fires to take place later in the year when seasons start to shift. Invasion by woody and exotic species was another one. Participants expressed concerns about the interactive effects of things like feral hogs on vegetation and how that might affect things like flammability. Also human dimensions. Along with the challenges that all fire practitioners face with public perception and encroaching development, there's an added layer of cattle stalking rates and landowners' adherence to management plans and individuality of management goals. So from those themes, participants identified the following outputs and questions. Working with seasonality and climate, future research could address longer-term water table data, as well as direct and indirect effects of burning different times of year, like January versus March versus May, and the mixing of mechanical and fire treatments. Invasive exotic research questions focused on the interactive effects between animal and plant species and the most effective treatments or fire prescriptions for different invasive plant species. Participants also identified a need for better communication tools like fact sheets to encourage the adoption of and adherence to management plans among landowners. Tools for managers like decision trees or the formation of a burn coalition for the South Central Florida region could be beneficial as well. So ultimately, what I learned is that fire is just one part of the story when it comes to changes among wetlands. Seasonal shifts in individual characteristics seem to play a much bigger role, at least in soil nutrient availability in these wetlands. In order to conclude one way or the other, though, more replicates. Wetlands are facing a lot of challenges today, and they're impacted by things like changing climate and shifting seasonality and woody and exotic invasion. I found that these systems are highly variable, and fire interacts with wetlands in complex ways. We still have a lot to learn about the effects of fire in wetlands, particularly when it comes to season and climate, invasive species, and their management in working lands. Continuing to build our knowledge around what happens when you bring these two forces together is important to their management moving. And I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone from the Agroecology Lab, branch operations, and everyone else who lent their support to this project. Thank you all for teaching me and welcoming me and just making my time at Archbold so very special. Thank you.
Question?
So where did your pool for your human dimensions come from? Did you have a small group, or what was that pool of respondents like?
Yeah, it was a small group. It was, I think 6 people total. And some people from mostly Archbold, but also NRCS.
Okay, but were there any ranchers, like specific
Yes, it was ranchers,
ranchers, land
land
managers?
managers,
Okay.
and researchers.
NRCS, yeah.
Yeah. Tahas.
It was good to see that your plant community shifted over time. What was how often are wetlands burned?
That really varies. So it on the ranch, specifically on Buck Island Ranch, it's part of some experimental treatments for other projects. And I'm not sure
About
what
3
the-
years, every 3 years.
Yeah.
About.
Okay. So it's 3 years so it takes 3 years for that community to move species composition.
Yeah, except Anna saw there was a short-term effect too, but we, like, when we do our surveys, we do it every year, but not shortly after fire. So that was kind of interesting to see that short-term effect.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Do you think there was any variation between the intensities of these wetland fires on the ranch?
Potentially. Originally, I planned to have some thermocouplers in the wetlands at each of my plots to measure how intense the fire was, which ended up not working out. But that would be a really interesting thing to look at going forward if the heat of the fire would affect that.
Good question. On your ash deposition data, did you see that change a lot from the day after fire to 1 month after fire? I'm just curious, does it get blown away, or do you think it gets incorporated into the soil?
I know that like from the literature, wind and rain and all of that stuff definitely does disperse it over time. When I sampled a month after, I didn't collect ash because there just really wasn't any there.
Okay.
There was a lot of still partially burned debris, but I just included that in litter cover.
Well, let's give Anna a hand.